The snow came quietly, the way the best things do. She knew it before she opened her eyes. Something in the quality of the silence, the way the air had thickened overnight into a particular hush that she had come to recognize the way other people recognize the smell of coffee or the sound of a screen door. She lay still beneath the wool blankets and listened to the mountain not moving, and then she rose and unlatched the heavy sliding door just far enough to see. Below the granite shelf, the valley was disappearing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, the way a photograph develops in reverse. The far ridgeline softening first, then the middle distance of pine and poplar going gray, then white, then gone, until all that remained visible was the near drop of the cliff face and the first 100 feet of canopy below it, dusted now with a fine powder that caught the early light and held it. The sky was the color of old pewter. The air smelled of cold stone and wood smoke. Her wood smoke. She turned back inside. The cast-iron stove still breathed, a faint orange pulse behind its iron door, and the single kerosene lantern on the shelf above the bed threw its amber light across the curved steel walls. The railcar groaned once, softly as the temperature shifted. A low, settling sound she no longer startled at. A sound she had learned to read the way you learn to read an old house, knowing the difference between the creak that means nothing and the creak that means pay attention. This one meant nothing. This one meant the cold was here and the walls were holding. She pulled the door shut against the snow and stood for a moment in the small, warm room that had, impossibly, become hers. 40 feet of rusted steel, balanced at the lip of a cliff in the western Carolina mountains. Stovepipe through the roof. Wool blankets on a narrow bed. 2 lanterns, a cache of tools, a wooden crate of another man's life, written in pencil on water-stained paper. A steep footpath, down to a ledge she had not yet known existed. A garden no one had tended in years, waiting beneath the late-season growth to be found. That was 5 weeks ago. 5 weeks since the last town had turned her away. Not cruelly, not all at once, but in the way of towns that have learned to look through certain kinds of people. The ones who arrive on foot with a pack on their back and nothing to offer. 5 weeks since she had followed the old tracks up into the mountain, without any particular expectation, only the reasonable calculation that the tracks had to go somewhere, and somewhere was better than here. She had not imagined this. She had not imagined arriving at the edge of the world and finding that someone had already thought to make it warm. The question was how. The answer started much further back. The answer started on a Tuesday, though she had stopped keeping careful track of days sometime around the end of August. She knew it was mid-October because the sourwood had already gone scarlet, and the afternoons were shortening fast, the light pulling away from the ridgelines before 5 o'clock, as if it had somewhere better to be. She had been in the small town at the foot of the mountain for 2 days, sleeping under the picnic shelter behind the Baptist church, spending what was left of her money on a tin of crackers and a cup of coffee at the gas station counter. She had asked about work, at the diner, at the hardware store, at a farmstead on the edge of town where a hand-lettered sign said, "Help needed." And each time the answer had been the same answer dressed in different clothes. "Not today. We just filled that. Maybe come back in spring." The last one, the farmstead, had been the most honest. A man in a barn coat who looked at her pack and her boots and said, not unkindly, that he wasn't set up to take on somebody who needed a place to sleep as well as wages. She understood. She had been understanding for a year. The person at the hardware store was the one who pointed her toward the logging road. An older man, not trying to be rid of her, just trying to give her something. He said there was a trail up through the national forest land, ran along an old rail grade, came out eventually near a Forest Service road on the far side of the mountain. He said it like she might be heading somewhere. She let him think that. She left town at 2 in the afternoon with what she had. A pack weighing perhaps 35 pounds, a half-full water bottle, the crackers, a pocket knife, a rain poncho folded into a stuff sack, and the particular economy of movement that comes from walking long distances when tired. Not hurrying, not dawdling, just covering ground. The logging road gave way to a two-track, and the two-track gave way to a path. And then, after a bend where a rusted culvert had half collapsed into the drainage ditch, she saw the first rail. Just the edge of it, lifted clear of the soil by tree roots, gleaming dully at the crown where weather had worn the rust thin. She stopped and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at where it led, into the tree line, up the slope, disappearing into shadow beneath hemlocks that had not been touched in decades. Tracks went somewhere. That was what tracks did. The mountains went dark above her as she walked. The ties were soft in places, solid in others, overgrown with moss and wood sorrel, and the occasional ambitious blackberry cane reaching across the grade. The rails narrowed the further she climbed. Narrow gauge, she would later learn, and the silence thickened the way it does above a certain elevation, a silence that was not empty but full. The tracks ended without warning. One moment they were threading through hemlock shadow, bending with the terrain the way old infrastructure does, apologetically, fitting itself around the mountain rather than demanding the mountain move. And then the trees simply stopped, and the world opened, and there was nothing ahead but sky, and the long, dim suggestion of a valley floor, so far below that it had already gone to darkness, while the ridgeline behind her still held the last of the afternoon. She stopped at the tree line and stood very still. The granite shelf extended perhaps 30 feet beyond the last hemlock, and at its far edge, balanced against the failing light like something a child had pushed to the lip of a table and not quite let fall, sat the railcar. It was enormous in the way that forgotten things often are, larger than they should be, because nothing around them has been built to offer scale. The steel skin had gone entirely to rust, a deep reddish-brown that was almost the color of old blood in the October light, streaked with black where water had run down the corrugated panels for 30 years. The trucks, the wheel assemblies, she would later learn the word for them, sat on a short section of intact track that terminated not 6 feet from the lip of the cliff. From where she stood, the angle of the grade and the angle of the light conspired to make the car appear to be leaning outward, tilted toward the drop, held by nothing. She looked at the valley below. A river moved through it, a thin silver thread catching what remained of the dusk. She could not hear it from here. She should have turned back. She understood that clearly, the way you understand things when your body has already begun to turn and your feet have shifted their weight. There was a town 11 miles behind her, and she had enough money, barely, for a meal and perhaps a floor to sleep on, if the cafe owner felt charitable. She had walked harder miles for worse outcomes. She knew how to do it. What she did not know how to do, it turned out, was walk away from a closed door when she was cold enough that her hands had stopped feeling like her own. She crossed the granite shelf slowly, testing each step, watching the railcar rather than the drop. Up close, the car was more solid than it had appeared. The fear was a trick of perspective. She noted it without fully believing it yet. The iron wedges chalked against the wheels were thick as her forearm and spiked to the granite beneath. She noted that too, filed it away. The sliding door had a latch. The latch was not locked. She stood with her hand on the cold iron for one long breath, the valley dark below her, and the first stars arriving above. And then she pulled the door open and stepped in out of the wind. The dark inside was complete at first, the kind of dark that has weight, that presses against the eyes until the eyes stop trying. She stood in the doorway with one hand still on the frame and let it settle around her. Not hostile, not empty either. Old dark. The dark of a place that had held warmth once and remembered the shape of it. She did not move until she understood what she was standing in. The smell reached her before anything else. Wood smoke, long absorbed into the walls. Dried herbs, something faintly mineral and clean. Then her eyes began their work. The lantern was on a shelf to her left, and beside it, a box of matches. She took one match and struck it against the shelf edge and held the small flame up and looked before she did anything else. That was habit. That was how you stayed safe in rooms you did not know. A cast-iron stove anchored the near end of the car. Squat, black, its legs bolted to a square of slate set into the floor. The stovepipe rose clean to the ceiling and through it. She crossed to it and opened the firebox and found newspaper and wood already laid. Old newspaper, brittle at the edges, but the wood beneath it was dry. She noted that. Someone had left this ready. Someone had expected to return. There were 2 kerosene lanterns. She lit the first with the match still in her hand, and the car opened up in warm amber. 40 feet of it. A narrow bed against the far wall, wood-framed, with wool blankets folded at the foot, in the particular way of someone who folds blankets the same way every time. A shelf of canned goods and glass jars above a low counter. A wooden crate beneath the counter, with papers visible at the top. Hand tools hung on the wall, handsaw, hammer, pry bar, each on its own nail. A single window on the valley side, shuttered from inside. She went back to the stove and lit it. The newspaper caught easily, and the kindling above it a moment later, and she stood with her hands near the open firebox until the larger wood took, and then she closed the door and listened to the stove begin its low, settling work. She had not been warm, truly warm, not the temporary warmth of a diner or a library closing at 5, in longer than she could easily count. The heat moved through her in stages, like a tide. Her fingers hurt as the feeling returned. She pressed them together and let them hurt. She sat down on the bed. The wool blankets were rough and they smelled of cedar. She pulled one around her shoulders and looked at the stove's small light through the grate, and at the lantern burning steadily on its shelf, and at the door she had pulled shut against the wind, and the dark, and the whole long falling world outside. She breathed. She did not get up for a long time. She woke to light she didn't recognize. Not the gray light of a culvert or the sickly amber of a highway rest stop. Something cleaner, something that came in horizontal and gold, and hit the far wall of the railcar, and spread slowly across the old pine boards, like a hand opening flat. She lay still and watched it, and for a moment she did not remember where she was. Then she did. She sat up. The stove had cooled to embers. Her breath showed faintly in the cold air, and the wool blanket had wound itself around her arms during the night. She unpeeled it and stood and crossed to the valley-side shutter and worked the latch and pushed it open, and the morning came in all at once. The depth of it, the distance, the whole blue-green bowl of forested valley, spread below like something spilled from a great height, ridgeline after ridgeline fading into haze, the sky above them an enormous and indifferent pale, and right there below the open window, the cliff edge and nothing between her and all of it but cold air, and maybe 60 feet of vertical granite face. She stepped back, then she stepped forward again. She looked down at the track beneath the car, what she could see of it, and at the ledge it rested on. The ledge was wide. That was the first thing. She had not been able to see that in the dark. She went outside. The morning air tasted of frost and wet stone and something faintly smoky from the stovepipe. She walked the length of the car on the uphill side first, trailing her hand along the steel skin, reading rust and rivets and the faint bow of old timber framing beneath. Then she walked around the cliff end and stood there looking at the front of the car and at the track beyond it and at the absolute nothing that followed. The rails ended cleanly, no curl, no collapse. They simply stopped, spiked firm into granite, and beyond them the shelf continued for another 4 feet before the edge proper. She crouched and looked. The chocks were iron, heavy, black, driven in pairs against both sides of each wheel on the cliff-facing truck. She put her hand on the nearest one and pushed. It didn't move. She set her full weight against it, and it still didn't move. She lay flat and crawled underneath. It took her the better part of 2 hours. She went over every inch of it, the bearing plates, the crusty bolts still sunk in solid granite, the wheel flanges seated cleanly on rail that had not moved in decades. She tested with her weight in a dozen places. She went back to the edge and studied the angle from below, from the side, from the rear. The danger was a trick of perspective. Standing at the uphill end and looking toward the cliff, the drop looked total. The car's position impossible. But the shelf was granite. The chocks were iron. The spiking held. She stood and brushed the grit from her palms. She went back inside and sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, listening to the stove tick as the metal expanded in the warmth. The lantern threw its soft yellow circle across the ceiling. Outside, the wind had come up again, moving through the spruce in long, slow waves. She felt something she could not yet name. Not safety exactly, not relief, but something quieter than either. The recognition, perhaps, that the ground beneath her was more solid than it looked. The crate was wooden, sitting beneath the bed frame on two small runners that kept it off the floor. She had noticed it before but left it. Now she pulled it out. The lid was not latched, just fitted. Inside, wrapped loosely in a piece of old canvas, were the notebooks, a dozen of them at least, some thick, some thin, all worn at the corners. The covers were plain, no labels. She lifted the top one and opened it. The handwriting was small and deliberate, pressed carefully into the page, as though the writer had understood that paper was not infinite. Dates ran along the left margin. She turned to the first entry. March 1968. Wood supply low but manageable. Found the spring running clear after the thaw. Cleared another 6 feet of the upper path. She read slowly. She was not a fast reader, and she did not try to be. The stove held its heat, and the lantern burned steadily, and she turned pages one at a time. There was no hurry, now, in the same way there had been no hurry since she had decided the ground would hold. He had lived here for 30 years. She kept arriving at that fact, the way you arrive at a tree that is wider than your arms can span. 30 years of entries, each one careful, practical, without self-pity. Water levels in the spring, first frost dates, which plants came back after a hard winter and which did not. The yields from the rock ledge below, the sage, the yarrow, the ginger, the cohosh, the others she did not yet have names for. Prices the general store had paid, recorded to the cent. Repairs made to the roof skin, to the stovepipe collar, to the flooring underfoot. She found the entry about the spring and read it twice. 50 yards back into the tree line, he had written, on a bearing of roughly northeast from the car's uphill door. Runs year-round, has not failed in 20 seasons. Gravity-fed, clean, cold, even in August. She looked up at the far wall, as if she could see through it. 50 yards, northeast. He had mapped everything, not on paper. There were no formal drawings, but in the slow accumulation of what he had noticed, tested, measured, and recorded. She was holding the map in her hands. She turned another page. The autumn light was long gone. The lantern burned. She kept reading. She found the entry about the path on the 43rd page of the second journal. Cut the brush back in October of '71. He had written. Goes down the east face in a series of natural shelves. Footing is sound if you know where to step. Mark the switchback at the third ledge. The rock looks like a drop, but sets back 2 feet. Caution in wet. Takes maybe 8 minutes if you go careful. She read it through twice, then tucked the journal under her arm and went outside into the morning. The path was not obvious. 30 years of autumns had done their patient work. Fallen leaves, encroaching laurel, a young birch growing directly across what had once been the clearest section. She worked from the base of the cliff's edge, moving east along the rim until the ground showed a slight depression, a suggestion that feet had once preferred this line over another. She followed it down. She carried the handsaw and the pry bar. The first two ledges cost her an hour each, not because the footing was dangerous, but because the scrub had grown thick, and she was not willing to hurry. She cut carefully, pulled the cut brush clear, stacked it against the rock face. The third ledge was exactly where he had written it would be. She set her foot against the apparent drop, felt the shelf behind it hold, and understood. You had to know. If you did not know, you would stop there and turn back. She did not turn back. The rock shelf opened below her, like a room she had not expected. Wide, wider than she had imagined from his descriptions, perhaps 60 feet across at its broadest, the outer edge dropping sharply into the valley below. The mountains stood across from her at eye level. She stopped and looked at them for a moment, the way you stop for something you have not earned yet, and are not sure you deserve. Then she turned and looked at what had been his garden. It was still there, reduced, crowded, half buried under 2 decades of encroaching grass and scrub, and the long ambition of the forest to reclaim what was once briefly cleared. But there, the sage was unmistakable, gray-green and woody-stemmed, gone leggy, but very much alive. The yarrow had spread rather than retreated, its feathery leaves threading through the grass in dense mats. The wild ginger she recognized from a drawing in the third journal, its leaves low and dark. The black cohosh stood taller than the rest, its seed stalks rattling dry in the mountain air, old growth that had seeded and spread and refused to give up the ground. She crouched and pressed her fingers into the soil. It was dark and loose and better than it had any right to be. She spent 2 full days on that ledge, cutting back what had overgrown the useful plants, clearing paths between them, learning by repetition and by the careful cross-referencing of his written descriptions against what her hands were actually touching. She had been avoiding the town the way you avoid a thing you need but are not certain you can handle yet. 11 miles was not a distance so much as a decision, but by the end of the second day on the ledge, crouched in the thin autumn light with soil under her fingernails, and the journal's descriptions working slowly through her mind, she had begun to understand that the garden was real, that the plants were real, that the question of what they might be worth was no longer idle. It required an answer she could not find on a mountainside. She left before first light, taking the trail by feel in the early gray, carrying nothing but the worn canvas pack, a folded paper, and enough caution to slow her steps at every switchback. The mountains came visible around her as she walked, ridge after ridge going pale and then gold in the rising morning. 11 miles in those hills was 3 hours if you moved with purpose. The town announced itself gradually, a mailbox on a gravel drive, then a tin roof through the trees, then the smell of wood smoke from something other than her own stove. She walked the main road without hurrying, reading the place the way she'd learned to read every place, where people paused, what they noticed, what they chose not to notice. She found the library first, because it was smaller and quieter and cost nothing to enter. The librarian, a woman somewhere past 60 with reading glasses on a cord, asked no questions. She set the girl up at a wide oak table with the county plat book stacked 3 volumes high and left her to it. The 1967 map was the one she needed. She found the spur line there, inked in faint dashes along the ridge contour, already labeled decommissioned, in small print that someone had added by hand, already forgotten before the decade was even out. She traced the line with one finger, from the junction near the old mill site, all the way to the cliff edge. The parcel surrounding it was not named, not claimed, just geography. The recorder's annex was 2 doors down from the post office, a narrow room with wood-paneled walls and filing cabinets that smelled of paper and patience. The clerk was a young man who seemed genuinely surprised to have a visitor. She explained carefully that she was researching a land parcel on the old logging spur, tax status, ownership history, current deed holder. He looked for a while, then he looked again. The parcel had no current deed holder on record. The last assessed owner had died sometime in the late 1980s and left no estate filing. Since then, tax default limbo, no action taken, no claim filed. She wrote down every word he said on the back of her folded paper. It was not a solution. She understood that clearly, standing in that narrow room with its smell of old records. But it was a door, and she had not known, until that moment, that a door existed. She had carried the herbs down the mountain in a flour sack, the same one she'd found folded at the back of the storage shelf. Sage first, cut with the old man's pocket knife, and hung in loose bundles from the railcar's interior crossbeams to dry, the way his journals described, in the moving air that found its way through the gaps she had not yet sealed. The yarrow had taken longer to bundle cleanly, its fine stems wanting to tangle, but she had learned patience from worse teachers than a plant. The walk into town was 11 miles on the trail, and she started before full light, the flour sack over one shoulder, her breath showing white in the cold morning air. She had rehearsed what she would say. Not the whole story, never the whole story, but enough, that she foraged, that she dried carefully, that she could supply regularly if the arrangement made sense. She had practiced the words until they felt plain rather than desperate. The general store sat at the near end of the main street, a wide porched building with hand-lettered signs in the window, and a screen door that announced every arrival with a long metallic groan. The smell inside was coffee and candle wax, and the particular sweetness of dried apple. The shopkeeper was behind the counter when she entered, a broad-shouldered older woman with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, and the unhurried manner of someone who has seen a great many kinds of people walk through that door and sorted them quickly into their proper categories. She set the flour sack on the counter and explained herself in the careful words she had practiced. The shopkeeper did not interrupt. When she finished, the woman lifted the sage bundle and held it to the light from the window, turning it slowly. She pulled a stem from the yarrow and rolled it between her fingers, then bent and smelled her hand. The two questions came without preamble. Where was it dried, and had it been washed before drying? She answered both. Dry air, clean water, from the spring the old man had marked in his notes. No mold, no contamination she could identify. The shopkeeper set the bundle down and was quiet for a moment. That felt longer than it probably was. She would take whatever was clean, dry, and honestly labeled. She named a price per ounce. A fair one, she said, not a generous one. She did not run a charity, but she ran an honest operation, and she expected the same in return. If the quality held, the arrangement could continue through the winter months, when certain customers came looking for exactly this kind of thing. The sum she carried home fit in her jacket pocket. It was not enough to change anything, not in a single afternoon. But she had not had a customer before, she had not had a product before, she had not had a before at all, until very recently. The money fit in her jacket pocket, and she walked the 11 miles back without stopping. She had done the arithmetic before she left town, not the arithmetic of the afternoon's earnings, but the longer kind. How many weeks until the passes filled with snow? How much deadfall she had already located on the slope above the car? How wide the gaps were between the steel skin panels on the valley-facing end, where the wind came through in the night like something with intent. She had been keeping a mental list for days, and the list was ready. The walk gave her time to finalize the order of it. She started the next morning before the light was full. The gaps in the steel skin were the first problem. Not the largest, but the most urgent, because cold entered through them the way water entered a failing roof, quietly and everywhere at once. She worked along the outer panels with strips of rubber she had cut from a collapsed boot she found in the deadfall, pressing them into the seams with the pry bar, seating wooden wedges above them where the metal had pulled away from the frame. The old man had done some of this himself. She could see his repairs beneath her own. Older wood, darkened with age, rubber cracked but still holding some of its original position. She followed his logic where it made sense, and corrected it where it didn't. The stovepipe collar came next. The seal around the roof penetration had dried and shrunk over the years until there was a gap she could fit 2 fingers through on the windward side. She packed it with a mixture of ash and wood fiber, dampened to a paste. Not a permanent fix, but serviceable until she could find proper stove cement in town. She tested the draw with a small fire and watched the smoke. It pulled clean. The firewood took 3 days. There was no shortage of deadfall on the slope. The ridge above the siding had shed branches and whole trunks for 30 years, with no one to move them. She worked with the handsaw, cutting to length, splitting what she could with the edge of the pry bar against a flat stone, stacking against the uphill wall where the car's body would hold the wood dry. Her hands blistered, and the blisters calloused, and she did not stop. The windbreak she built from timber on the cliffside end, lashing pieces together with rope salvaged from the old man's stores, weighting the base with stones from the shelf. It was rough work and she knew it, but it broke the direct run of wind off the valley, and the difference on the first cold night was measurable. She recorded all of it in the back pages of his last journal, because there was no other paper. The entries were brief: dates, tasks, what held, what needed doing again. She had not planned to write. She had picked up the pen to note a measurement and found she kept going. The rain came in the night without warning. Not the slow autumn drizzle she had grown used to, but a hard driving wall of it that hit the car like something thrown. She lay still in the dark and listened. The stovepipe held. The patches of rolled felt she had worked into the seams along the roofline held. Water ran down the exterior in sheets, and she heard it, but she did not feel it, and that was the whole of the matter. She kept the stove low through the night, banking it carefully, the way his journals had described for wet weather, when the draw could change. The temperature outside fell toward freezing by the early hours, and she knew it by the sound the rain made against the steel, a harder note, nearly crystalline, and by the way the lantern flame stood perfectly still, even when the gusts hit. Cold had sealed the gaps that wind alone could not. She slept in intervals, waking to check the stove and the seals, and then sleeping again. By the third waking, she stopped worrying. Everything was holding. Toward dawn, she lit the second lantern and reached for the journals. She had been reading them in order, rationing them almost, the way she might ration the canned goods, not from sentiment, but because she had recognized early that they were also instruction. His first winter on the ledge, 1967. He had arrived late in October, the same as her, and he had written about the rain with the same attention she was giving it now. The roof leaked in 4 places, and I spent the first 3 nights learning each one. He had patched them with pine pitch and scrap canvas. He had built his windbreak from timber, and it had come partly down in a November gale, and he had rebuilt it heavier. He had written, "What the weather breaks, the weather teaches." She sat with that for a long time, the lantern close, the stove ticking gently with heat, the rain easing outside to something ordinary. In the morning, the ledge was washed clean, and the air had the hard clarity that follows a near freeze. The firewood under its lean-to was dry. The spring ran clear, the sediment it had kicked up in the rain already settling out. She walked the herb rows slowly, with her hands in her pockets, taking inventory the way she had learned to do, looking at what the rain had flattened or stripped, and what it had not. She almost walked past it. The black cohosh stood at the far end of the ledge in a low depression she had taken for bare rock, half hidden under a ledge overhang that had kept it sheltered and dark. 3 dense clusters, the stems heavy, the seed heads rattling dry in the cold morning air. She crouched and looked at them for a long time. She went back for the journal and recorded the location carefully, with measurements. The snow came without announcement, the way the old man had written it always did at this elevation, not with wind or warning, but simply appearing in the early dark, fine and steady, filling the valley below until the trees dissolved into gray and the far ridgeline went entirely. She woke to the silence of it. She had learned by then to read silence in grades. The silence of empty woods, the silence of frost, the silence of held breath before weather. This was the last kind. She lay still for a moment, listening, then got up and opened the cargo door a careful inch. White. The granite shelf white, the ledge below white, the valley below that a soft erasure. The stovepipe above her was already drawing. She had banked the fire before sleep, as a matter of habit now, the same habit she had begun to think of as the thing that separated where she had been from where she was. You bank a fire when you have somewhere to come back to. She dressed and filled the stove and stood in the doorway with her hands wrapped around a tin mug of water heated on the grate, watching the snow come down with its particular indifference to everything beneath it. The cliff edge was invisible. The valley was invisible. The granite shelf held firm under half an inch of white, and would hold under more. She knew that now, had confirmed it in the old man's notes, and with her own hands, and with the simple evidence of 6 weeks of weather that had not moved the car one fraction of an inch. The adverse possession inquiry was filed, a single sheet of paper submitted to the county recorder's annex, with her careful handwriting and $2 in filing fees, a process measured in years, not weeks. The clerk had told her plainly it might come to nothing. She had thanked him and walked the 11 miles back in the cold with a bag of cornmeal and lamp oil and a tin of coffee, and had not thought about nothing. She had thought about the firewood stacked 3 cords high under the lean-to, dry and sound. About the Black Cohosh location, recorded in the journal, with her own measurements added beneath the old man's. About the shopkeeper's standing order for sage and yarrow, and the 4 visits remaining in the season, before the roads became unreliable. She did not own this place. She understood that clearly, and held it clearly. The way you hold something you are not yet permitted to set down. But the snow fell on the roof of the car, with the same unhurried weight it fell on the granite shelf, on the valley below, on the old herb rows she had mapped and tended and harvested. It fell on everything that intended to stay. Inside, the lantern made one amber rectangle against the white. The stovepipe sent up its thin line of smoke. The valley below held the light of the snow, and gave nothing back, and she watched it, and she stayed.